At 2:48 a.m. local time, a single missile punched out of the South China Sea at Mach 6 and detonated 320 meters off the starboard beam of an American warship. Not a drill, not a warning through diplomatic channels. A live YJ-21 air-launched ballistic missile released from the Type 055 destroyer Lhasa during what Beijing would later call a routine no-notice live-fire exercise window, and what every officer on the USS Curtis Wilbur's bridge experienced as something else entirely. The terminal phase plume lit up the water between the two ships like a flare. Shock plates on the destroyer's forward hull buckled. 3 VLS cell hatches jammed shut. The SPY-1D phased array radar on the forward face went amber on diagnostics. Not offline, but degraded, the worst possible state for a ship that depends on continuous radar picture to defend itself. 2 sailors on the bridge wing took flash burns from the thermal bloom. Below decks, the shock wave was violent enough to throw unsecured equipment from shelving, knock a petty officer off a ladder in the forward machinery space, and trip a circuit breaker on the auxiliary power distribution board in Combat Information Center. The ship's systems recovered. The crew did not immediately know how close the margins had been. The number that tells you everything about what just happened: 320 meters. The YJ-21 CEP, circular error probable, the radius within which it hits its aim point 50% of the time, is estimated at under 10 meters against a ship-sized target, which means the Lhasa's Combat Information Center chose 320 meters, not 3,200 meters, not a symbolic splash on the horizon. 320 meters, close enough to burn American sailors, far enough to avoid the one decision that cannot be walked back. The question that went straight up the chain to PACFLT, and from there to every command center tracking the South China Sea at 3 a.m., was the same question you're probably asking right now. Was USS Curtis Wilbur the target? Or the warning shot? We are going to answer that. But to understand why the answer matters, you need to understand what was already airborne when the YJ-21 hit the water. Before we go further, pause on that question for a second. The Lhasa just bracketed an American destroyer with a hypersonic missile 320 meters off the beam. The captain's report is already moving up to 7th Fleet. What happens next? A. The U.S. files a formal protest, pulls Curtis Wilbur back, and treats this as a calibrated Chinese provocation that doesn't warrant military escalation. B. The response is already in motion. Something was pre-positioned for exactly this scenario, and it launches before the deck crew finishes sweeping the foredeck. C. Something else entirely happens, and it involves an aircraft that has been holding a 4-hour orbit over the Indian Ocean that nobody in Beijing knew was there. Drop your call. A, B, or C in the comments right now. We'll be back at this question in about 4 minutes. And if you think you know what a B-1B loaded with JASSM-ER does to a runway at 3:16 a.m., write it out. Let's see who read this the way the targeting cell at Diego Garcia did. Here is what was happening while the Curtis Wilbur's damage control team was still processing what hit them. Somewhere over the eastern Indian Ocean, flying a racetrack orbit at altitude on a tanker-supported maritime strike profile, a single B-1B Lancer from the 28th Bomb Wing Detachment at Diego Garcia had been holding for just over 4 hours. The aircraft's internal weapons bays carried AGM-158C LRASM, long-range anti-ship missiles, and AGM-158 BJASSM-ER standoff cruise missiles pre-coordinated against a target package on Fiery Cross Reef that had been sitting in the Joint Operations Center's approved strike folder since the previous week's escalation assessment. The B-1B is not a subtle aircraft. It weighs 477,000 pounds at maximum takeoff. Its 4 F101 GE-102 engines generate 30,780 pounds of thrust each. The airframe was designed in the 1970s to penetrate Soviet air defenses at low altitude and supersonic speed, and it has been rebuilt twice since then into the most capable conventional strike platform the Air Force flies. The B-1B cannot carry nuclear weapons. That capability was stripped in the 1990s under arms control agreements. but it can carry 75,000 pounds of precision conventional ordnance across 3 internal bays. Nothing in the U.S. inventory carries more. Not the B-2, not the B-52, not the F-35. The aircraft the Air Force has spent 15 years trying to retire turned out to be the one they needed most on this particular night. Inside the B-1B's flight deck, the 4-person crew had been cycling through alert states for most of their orbit. The aircraft commander, a lieutenant colonel, had been briefed on the Curtis Wilbur's transit path before takeoff. He knew where the Arleigh Burke was. He knew what Fiery Cross looked like on the targeting display. He had flown this orbit twice in the previous 3 weeks, 2 prior conditional strike postures that never reached the release threshold. On both occasions, the aircraft turned for home with a full weapons bay. Tonight, the targeting cell at Diego Garcia was transmitting on a different cadence. The crew noticed before the message arrived. At 3:07 a.m. local time, 19 minutes after the YJ-21 impacted the water 320 meters off USS Curtis Wilbur's starboard beam, the B-1B crew received the release authorization. The air tasking order had moved faster than anyone outside the command structure would have expected because the target coordinates were preloaded. The ROE had been pre-authorized under a conditional strike package, and the only decision required at 3:07 a.m. was whether the conditions for execution had been met. A hypersonic ballistic missile fired at an American warship in international waters apparently met the conditions. Now, let us talk about the YJ-21, because what it did to USS Curtis Wilbur is only half of the tactical problem. What it represents to every Arleigh Burke-class destroyer in the Pacific is the other half. The YJ-21. NATO designation, CHASX-13, is China's first air-launched hypersonic anti-ship ballistic missile. Publicly revealed in 2022, it entered operational deployment on H-6N strategic bombers and, more recently, on Type 055 Renhe-class destroyers in a surface-launched configuration. The missile follows a semi-ballistic trajectory. It goes up like a ballistic missile, then maneuvers in the terminal phase like a hypersonic glide vehicle, pulling high G turns in the final 30 to 40 seconds of flight to defeat point defense intercept geometry. Terminal velocity estimated at Mach 6, roughly 4,500 miles per hour. At that speed, from detection to impact, the missile gives the target ship approximately 8 to 12 seconds of reaction time. Depending on the radar picture, the threat assessment software, and whether the Combat Information Center is already in a heightened defense posture or running routine watch conditions at 2:48 a.m. USS Curtis Wilbur was running routine watch conditions. This is not a failure of the crew. The Arleigh Burke was transiting a freedom of navigation lane northeast of Fiery Cross Reef, a transit the U.S. Navy has conducted dozens of times in recent years, a deliberate assertion of international maritime law in waters where China claims sovereignty it does not legally possess. The Curtis Wilbur had no pre-mission intelligence indicating the Lhasa was in a live fire configuration. The Type 055 had been tracked by maritime patrol aircraft earlier in the evening, logged as conducting standard patrol operations, and placed in the normal tactical picture. What the patrol aircraft picture did not have, the Lhasa had loaded a YJ-21 on its shipborne launcher during a period when the P-8 Poseidon overhead was in a sensor shadow created by a rain squall northeast of the Paracels. 47 minutes of reduced coverage. That was enough. To understand what those 47 minutes cost operationally, you need to understand what the P-8 Poseidon mission profile looked like in the hours before the launch. The aircraft had been flying a figure-8 surveillance pattern that kept the Lhasa inside its sensor basket for the better part of 6 hours. The crew had logged routine communications, intercepts, surface radar emissions consistent with normal navigation, and a thermal profile from the Type 055's exhaust stacks indicating standard transit speed engine settings. Nothing elevated. Nothing that flagged a weapons configuration change. The rain squall that drifted across the northeastern Paracels at 1:52 a.m. was not a tactical maneuver by either side. It was weather. And in the gap it created, a crew aboard the Lhasa worked very quickly and very quietly to bring a YJ-21 launcher to operational readiness. Here's what makes the geometry worse than it looks on paper. The SM-6, the Arleigh Burke's primary long-range interceptor, has been assessed as capable against medium-range ballistic missiles in the terminal phase. In a prepared, alerted engagement against a target the radar has been tracking from launch, the SM-6 gives the destroyer a fighting chance. The system costs $5, $3 million per round, and carries a 137-pound blast fragmentation warhead designed to detonate near enough to a ballistic re-entry vehicle to knock it off course. Against a YJ-21 at Mach 6 in a maneuvering terminal phase, with 8 seconds from threat detection to impact and a combat information center not in an elevated defense posture, the SM-6 math gets ugly very quickly. The missile has to be on the rail, the radar track has to be established, and the intercept geometry has to work. Miss any one of those conditions and the $5. 3 million interceptor fires at empty sky while the $15 million YJ-21 continues its trajectory. The YJ-21 that hit the water 320 meters off Curtis Wilbur's beam was not intercepted. The ship's Combat Information Center detected the launch, identified the track, and assessed time to impact at under 10 seconds by the time the radar picture was clear enough to classify the threat. The SM-6 was not fired. The duty officer made the correct call. There was no intercept window that worked within the available geometry, and the crew went to damage control stations. 3 VLS cell hatches buckled from shock loading. The SPY-1D forward face degraded to amber diagnostic state, still operating, but with compromised track accuracy and range. 2 sailors took thermal burns from the terminal plume, treated on board, not life-threatening. The Lhasa sat 22 nautical miles to the northwest and waited. What the crew of the Curtis Wilbur did in the 19 minutes after that missile hit the water deserves to be described precisely, because it is the part of this story that gets compressed into shorthand and loses something in the compression. The commanding officer, called from his sea cabin at the first alarm, reached the bridge in under 90 seconds. By the time he arrived, the executive officer had already initiated damage control condition, WAC-E, and ordered the ship to increase speed and begin an evasive course change. Standard procedure following any ordnance event in the ship's vicinity, whether hostile or ambiguous. The chief engineer was on the phone from main control within 2 minutes. 3 separate damage control teams were moving through the ship in parallel, one to the VLS magazine forward, one to the Combat Information Center equipment spaces, one to the bridge wing to assess the 2 injured sailors. The 2 sailors, a boatswain's mate, 3rd class, and a fire controlman, 2nd class, had been standing watch on the port bridge wing, facing away from the impact when the YJ-21 detonated. The thermal bloom from the terminal phase explosion reached them as a wave of heat that lasted less than a second. Both sustained first-degree burns to exposed skin on their forearms and the backs of their necks. Neither required evacuation. Both were treated by the ship's independent duty corpsmen and returned to a medical observation status that allowed them to remain at their duty stations. The commanding officer had his damage report within 11 minutes. The ship was maneuverable. The main battery was functional except for the 3 jammed VLS hatches. The SPY-1D was degraded but tracking. The engineering plant was nominal. Curtis Wilbur was hurt, but not out of the fight. At that point, the commanding officer made a second decision that does not appear in any official statement. He held course. He did not withdraw. He slowed the evasive maneuver and brought the ship back to a heading that kept it in the freedom of navigation lane. If the Lhasa wanted a second engagement, the Curtis Wilbur was going to be exactly where international law said it had the right to be. The Lhasa did not fire again. What the Lhasa's Combat Information Center did not have in their tactical picture, and what was the single largest intelligence failure of the evening from Beijing's perspective, was the B-1B. The aircraft had been flying its 4-hour orbit on a route that kept it outside the detection envelope of every PLA Navy surface radar and every PLA Air Force ground-based air defense sensor in the South China Sea Theater. The orbit was designed to be invisible. The Airspace Management Cell at Yokosuka had coordinated the flight profile to exploit a coverage gap between the Dongsha Islands radar network to the north and the Spratly Islands sensor cluster to the south. The B-1B was flying in the seam between them, at an altitude and route that placed it consistently below the radar line of sight for both networks. China did not know the B-1B was there. At 3:16 a.m. local time, 28 minutes after the YJ-21 detonated off USS Curtis Wilbur's beam, the first JASSM-ER crossed the reef wall at Fiery Cross. The AGM-158B-JASSM-ER has a range of approximately 575 miles. It flies at subsonic speed, around Mach 0.75, on a terrain-following autopilot that keeps it below radar coverage for most of its flight profile. The warhead is a 1,000-pound WDU-42/B penetrating blast fragmentation package. Guidance combines GPS, infrared scene matching, and a data link that allows in-flight retargeting. Each missile costs approximately $1, $4 million. The B-1B can carry 24 of them in its internal bays. The target package on Fiery Cross Reef consisted of 3 coordinates: the main runway, the fuel storage farm on the island's eastern arm, and the revetment containing an HQ-9B surface-to-air missile battery that the targeting cell had assessed as the primary air defense threat to any follow-on strike package in the area. The runway received 4 JASSM-ER impacts across its 3,000-meter length. The guidance accuracy placed each warhead within meters of its designated aim point. The penetrating warheads punched through the reinforced concrete surface before detonating, collapsing subsurface drainage infrastructure and creating craters that cannot be rapidly repaired. A runway that takes years to build in a contested maritime environment and requires constant logistics support to maintain. You do not fill those craters with trucks and concrete in the middle of the night. The fuel farm received 2 missiles. The secondary explosions from jet fuel storage were visible on satellite imagery taken 40 minutes after the strike. The fires burned for the next 6 hours. The HQ-9B revetment received 3 impacts. The HQ-9B is China's primary long-range surface-to-air missile system, a derivative of the Russian S-300, with a range of approximately 200 kilometers and a radar capable of tracking multiple targets simultaneously. 3 JASSM-ER warheads against a hardened revetment is not a guaranteed kill. But 3 penetrating 1,000-pound warheads against the launcher vehicles, radar components, and support equipment stored inside a revetment that was not designed to absorb that specific threat profile is a very different calculation than the one the HQ-9B battery crew would have made when they went to sleep. The battery fell silent. What the commercial satellite imagery captured 40 minutes after the strike tells you something about the scale of what 9 JASSM-ER missiles accomplished against a facility that took years to build. The fuel farm was a column of black smoke visible from 60 miles. The runway, photographed in the first available daylight pass, showed 4 distinct crater clusters spaced across its length. Not concentrated at one end, but distributed specifically to ensure no usable takeoff roll remained. Whoever built the target package understood runway denial. You do not put all 4 warheads at the threshold. You space them. You make the math impossible for an aircraft trying to find a window. The garrison on Fiery Cross at the time of the strike numbered approximately 200 personnel based on open-source estimates, a mix of PLA Navy, PLA Air Force, and People's Armed Police components. None of the JASSM-ER impacts targeted personnel or inhabited structures. The runway, the fuel farm, the HQ-9B revetment, infrastructure, capability. The message was precise in a way that a less carefully constructed target package would not have been. Someone had thought hard about what to destroy and what to leave standing. Put yourself in the Lhasa's captain's position at 3:20 a.m. 22 nautical miles northwest of Fiery Cross Reef, the island you are operating in support of is burning. The air defense battery that was supposed to cover your position has stopped transmitting. You have no picture on what struck the reef. Your air search radar is scanning and finding nothing, because the B-1B released from 575 miles away and never entered your detection envelope. You do not know if there are more missiles already in the air. You do not know if there is a submarine tracking you. You know one thing with certainty: Fiery Cross is burning, and something caused that, and you cannot see it. The Lhasa turned north at flank speed at 3:22 a.m. A leaked SITREP from the Joint Operations Center at Yokosuka, reported by 3 separate defense outlets in the hours after the engagement, describes the Type 055 retreating at sustained high speed, active radar emissions increasing as the crew attempted to build a wider picture of what was in the water around them. The SITREP notes, with the kind of precision that suggests the information came from signals intelligence rather than surface search, that the Lhasa did not transmit a firing report to its parent command before turning north. The engagement had gone somewhere the Lhasa's crew had not planned for it to go. The signals intelligence picture of the Lhasa's communications in the 30 minutes following the B-1B strike is, on its own, a detailed story about an organization processing a situation it did not expect. The Type 055's electronic emissions shifted from the quiet, disciplined profile of a ship running a deliberate operation to the elevated, searching profile of a command information center trying to reconstruct a tactical picture that had collapsed. Multiple frequencies, rapid transmission sequences. The characteristics, according to the signals analysis described in the SITREP, of a crew talking very fast to people who are not answering as quickly as expected. The Lhasa's parent command in the PLA South Sea Fleet apparently took several minutes longer than normal to respond to the initial contact reports. The signals analysts at Yokosuka noted the gap. That gap, the time between the Lhasa's first transmission after turning north and the first coherent response from the Fleet Command, was the period during which the PLA South Sea Fleet was processing the same question the Lhasa's captain was asking: what struck Fiery Cross? From where? And is it still happening? This is where the authorial voice on this story needs to be clear about something. What strikes us about this engagement is not the firepower on either side. Both were performing exactly as designed. What's striking is the decision architecture. The YJ-21 launch was authorized by someone in the Lhasa's command chain, or above it, who calculated that a 320-meter bracket was a precisely calibrated message. Not an act of war, a demonstration. The problem with precisely calibrated demonstrations at Mach 6 is that the other side's response is also precisely calibrated. And the other side had pre-positioned a B-1B with a pre-authorized conditional strike package before the demonstration began. The escalation ladder was already loaded. China stepped on one rung and found the next rung had been waiting. Now let us talk about the B-1B, because this aircraft deserves more explanation than it typically gets. And the reason the Air Force chose it for this mission over the F-35, the B-2, and every other platform in the inventory tells you something important about how modern standoff strike actually works. The B-1B Lancer entered service in 1986. It was designed as a low-level supersonic penetrating bomber intended to fly under Soviet radar at Mach 1, 25 at 200 feet, and deliver nuclear gravity bombs. The Soviet Union dissolved before the B-1B fired a shot in anger. Congress immediately began asking why it was paying for a nuclear delivery aircraft that no longer had a nuclear mission. The Air Force spent the next 2 decades converting it into something else. The nuclear systems came out. Precision, conventional weapons came in. The defensive avionics suite was upgraded. The data links were modernized. The weapons bay was certified for every major standoff munition in the inventory. What emerged from that rebuild was not the aircraft the Air Force originally designed. It was something considerably more dangerous in the specific context of sustained long-range conventional strike. The B-1B can carry 75,000 pounds of ordnance and fly 5,500 miles without refueling, with a single tanker orbit, the kind the aircraft was already conducting when the YJ-21 hit the water. Its effective operational range extends across the entire Pacific theater from a base in Diego Garcia. The aircraft does not need to be positioned in a forward base that China can target. It does not need to fly from Guam, which sits inside the PLA's missile envelope. It launches JASSM-ER from 575 miles away and turns around before the missiles arrive. An F-35 doing the same mission would need to get within 150 miles of the target to release weapons from an internal bay. Well, within the coverage of the HQ-9B battery that the B-1B's JASSM-ER took offline before the F-35 would have entered range. A B-2 could have done the mission from stealth, but there are 20 B-2S in the entire U.S. inventory. They fly from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, and each combat sortie requires 30-plus hours and 6 aerial refuelings. The B-1B flew from Diego Garcia, 4 hours away, and was already on orbit when the YJ-21 launched. The aircraft that top Pentagon officials spent 15 years calling obsolete turned out to be the right tool for exactly this mission, not despite its age. Because of the weapons it was certified to carry and the range at which it could carry them. There is a personnel detail about the B-1B detachment at Diego Garcia that rarely appears in coverage of the aircraft's operational deployments, but which matters for understanding how the 4-hour orbit was sustained that night. The detachment had been forward deployed for 11 weeks by the time of the engagement. The crew that flew the strike mission was on their 3rd rotation through the orbit profile. They had flown the same racetrack twice before, at the same altitudes, on the same tanker coordination schedule, against the same preloaded target package, and returned home both times without releasing a weapon. The aircraft commander later described the 3rd orbit as indistinguishable from the first 2 until the release authorization arrived. Same frequencies, same coordinates, same weapons load. The professionalism required to maintain that level of readiness across 11 weeks and 3 identical profiles, knowing that any one of them might be the one that crosses the threshold, is not a small thing. It is what makes a conditional strike framework operationally real rather than theoretically possible. Here is the math this entire engagement rests on. A single YJ-21 missile, approximately $15 million. The damage it caused to USS Curtis Wilbur, 3 jammed VLS hatches, 1 degraded radar face, 2 sailors with treatable burns. Cost to repair, assessed at under $4 million for the ship, weeks in a forward maintenance facility, 1 destroyer temporarily removed from the 7th Fleet Force structure. The JASSM-ER package, 9 missiles at $1, $4 million each. Total ordnance cost, $12, $6 million. The damage to Fiery Cross, a runway that cannot operate fixed-wing aircraft, a fuel farm that burned for 6 hours, and an air defense battery that stopped transmitting. Cost to replace and repair. Open-source defense analysis places the reconstruction cost for the runway alone at over $200 million in materials and logistics. In an environment where every bag of concrete has to arrive by ship or aircraft from the mainland, 800 miles away, China spent $15 million on a demonstration. The United States spent $12, $6 million on a response. The net exchange ratio favors the side that used a 40-year-old aircraft and a standoff missile that fits in a cargo bay. Run the attrition math on that equation long enough, and the strategic picture becomes clear very quickly. There is a detail in the SITREP from Yokosuka that has not received the attention it deserves in the hours since this engagement became public. The document notes that the B-1B's release authorization came 19 minutes after the YJ-21 impacted the water, 19 minutes from splash to release order. For context, a standard deliberate strike authorization in peacetime, going through the full chain from theater commander to SecDef to president, typically requires hours. Sometimes days, depending on the legal reviews, the intelligence assessments, and the diplomatic consultations. 19 minutes means the authorization was pre-delegated. The conditional strike package, the one targeting Fiery Cross specifically in response to a direct kinetic action against a U.S. warship in international waters, had already been approved. The decision had already been made. All that was required at 3:07 a.m. was confirmation that the triggering condition had been met. Someone in the National Command Authority had thought through this specific scenario, a Chinese missile bracketing an American destroyer in the Spratlys, and had pre-authorized the response before it happened. The B-1B was not scrambled. It was already on orbit. The JASSM-ER was not hastily loaded. It was already in the bay. The target coordinates were not rapidly calculated. They were preloaded. This was not improvisation. This was a conditional strike framework that had been sitting in an approved folder, waiting for a Chinese decision that would trigger it. To appreciate what 19 minutes actually represents in the bureaucratic physics of the American national security structure, consider what had to happen in that window. The Curtis Wilbur's commanding officer transmitted a contact report up the chain. That report reached 7th Fleet, which forwarded an initial assessment to PACOM. PACOM pulled the conditional strike package and transmitted a recommendation to the Joint Chiefs. The Joint Chiefs relayed to SecDef. SecDef confirmed that the triggering conditions as pre-authorized were met and transmitted release authority back down to theater. Theater passed release authorization to the B-1B crew. The crew confirmed weapons status and released. All of that. 19 minutes. The only way that timeline is possible is if every person in that chain had already rehearsed exactly this scenario, had the package in front of them before the call came, and had pre-agreed on the decision criteria so that actual execution required no deliberation. Only confirmation. The decision had been made weeks or months earlier. The 19 minutes was just the time it took to confirm that the real world had matched the scenario planning. Here is the part that does not sit comfortably, no matter which side of this you examine. The Lhasa's captain, or whoever authorized the YJ-21 launch above him, made a calculation that a 320-meter bracket was controllable, that it communicated resolve without crossing a threshold that would produce a military response. That is a reasonable calculation if you believe the other side is operating purely within a diplomatic response framework. Protests, demarches, statements at the UN, possible naval shadowing. It is not a reasonable calculation if the other side has a pre-positioned B-1B on a conditional strike orbit and a pre-approved target package. In Beijing, based on the Lhasa's retreat at flank speed and the absence of any PLA retaliatory action in the 48 hours following the strike, appears to have discovered that the second framework was the one actually in play. Here's the take that will probably generate disagreement. The 320-meter bracket was not reckless miscalculation. It was a probe. Beijing was testing whether the conditional strike framework existed, whether the United States had actually pre-delegated strike authority for this scenario, or whether the response would remain in the diplomatic lane. They now have their answer, which means the next escalation decision in Beijing will be made with full knowledge that a B-1B may already be on orbit. That changes the calculus in ways that are not yet visible in public statements. Would you have made the same call as the Lhasa's captain? Or would the existence of that pre-positioned aircraft, which you couldn't see, have changed your decision? Think about that for a second. Because the intelligence failure here is not just tactical, it's structural. The PLA has spent 20 years building anti-access capabilities designed to keep American aircraft carriers out of the South China Sea. It has invested less energy in understanding the pre-delegation authority frameworks that govern American standoff strike from beyond its sensor envelope. The Pentagon has not confirmed or denied the SITREP. The official statement, released through the Department of Defense press office in the hours following the engagement, describes a defensive strike in response to an unprovoked kinetic action against a U.S. Navy vessel conducting lawful freedom of navigation operations. The statement does not name the B-1B. It does not specify which assets were used. It confirms that 2 U.S. sailors sustained injuries and that USS Curtis Wilbur remains operational. The Chinese Ministry of National Defense statement, released approximately 6 hours later, describes the YJ-21 launch as part of scheduled live-fire training in designated exercise areas and characterizes the Curtis Wilbur's transit as a deliberate provocation in Chinese territorial waters. The statement does not address Fiery Cross. It does not mention the B-1B. It does not explain why the Lhasa retreated north at flank speed or why the HQ-9B battery on Fiery Cross has stopped transmitting. Both statements are, in the technical sense, accurate. Neither tells you what actually happened. We spent several hours going through the open-source intelligence picture after the SITREP became public. The commercial satellite imagery, the signals data reported by independent monitoring organizations, the AIS track of the Lhasa before and after the engagement, and one detail kept standing out above everything else. The Lhasa's transit lane in the hours before the YJ-21 launch put it in a position that was not consistent with routine patrol operations. It was consistent with a pre-planned live-fire window. The ship's course, speed, and heading in the 2 hours before the launch suggest the crew knew exactly where they were going and why. This was not a spontaneous decision made by a destroyer captain who spotted an American ship and decided to make a point. This was planned, which means someone, somewhere in the PLA command structure, made a decision in the days before this engagement, during the planning phase, during the mission authorization phase, that a 320-meter bracket of an American destroyer in the Spratlys was an acceptable action with acceptable consequences. They were wrong about the second part. Here is what the damage picture at Fiery Cross tells you about where South China Sea escalation management currently sits. China spent approximately a decade and $1. $3 billion constructing and militarizing the artificial islands in the Spratly chain: Fiery Cross, Subi Reef, Mischief Reef. These islands were designed to project power, air defense coverage over the South China Sea, logistic support for planned surface units, airfields capable of hosting fighter and maritime patrol aircraft. The HQ-9B batteries on Fiery Cross were specifically positioned to create an air defense bubble that would complicate any American strike package trying to operate in the southern South China Sea. A single B-1B strike using 9 JASSM-ER missiles just demonstrated that the bubble has a gap. The JASSM-ER was released from 575 miles, well outside the HQ-9B's 125-mile engagement range. The missile flew under radar coverage. The battery never had a firing solution. The air defense system that was supposed to make Fiery Cross untouchable did not fire a single interceptor. The island is still there. The runways can be repaired. The HQ-9B batteries can be replaced. None of that changes the fundamental tactical revelation. The standoff range of the B-1B's weapons package exceeds the coverage radius of China's island-based air defenses by 450 miles. If that gap was not fully understood in Beijing's operational planning before last night, it is fully understood now. The reconstruction timeline for Fiery Cross is worth stating plainly because it frames the cost of what was destroyed in a way that the dollar figure alone does not. The runway, 3,000 meters of reinforced concrete on an artificial island built from dredged coral over a decade, requires specific repair materials that are not stockpiled on the reef: aggregate, structural concrete mix, runway pavement equipment. All of it has to come by sea from facilities on Hainan Island, 800 miles to the north. The South China Sea in late summer carries weather patterns that complicate sustained logistics. Conservative engineering estimates for the crater repairs, depending on the subsurface damage from the penetrating warheads, run from 4 to 8 weeks under ideal conditions. If the subsurface drainage infrastructure collapsed as comprehensively as the crater pattern suggests, the timeline extends further. Fiery Cross will not be conducting fixed-wing flight operations in the near term, and every logistics ship that makes the 800-mile run to support the repair effort is doing so inside a threat envelope that now includes the B-1B orbit track that nobody in Beijing knew existed last week. We told you in the video on the B-21 Raider deployment to the Pacific that the United States was investing in long-range standoff strike, specifically to address the A2AD envelope China had built in the first island chain. What we showed you was the aircraft. What we did not show you was the pre-delegation authority framework that makes the aircraft tactically useful in a time-sensitive scenario. That framework is the mechanism that turned a 4-hour orbit over the Indian Ocean into a 19-minute decision cycle. The B-21 will inherit that framework when it reaches operational deployment. The B-1B is demonstrating the concept now. Subscribe to Global Warfare TV if this changes how you think about South China Sea escalation. Because what the Lhasa's captain discovered last night is the same thing the Pentagon has been building toward for the better part of a decade. Here is what the next 72 hours will likely determine. The Lhasa is retreating north. Fiery Cross is burning. USS Curtis Wilbur is assessed as operational with degraded radar capability. The Pentagon has confirmed a defensive strike without specifying assets. Beijing has not publicly acknowledged the Fiery Cross damage. The question that the command centers at Yokosuka, at PACOM, and in the E-Ring are working through right now is the same question that has defined every South China Sea escalation cycle for the past decade. What does Beijing do next? 3 plausible responses. Beijing accepts the exchange, absorbs the Fiery Cross damage, and returns to the established pattern of graduated provocation. Lower on the escalation ladder, with a clearer understanding of where the pre-authorized response thresholds sit. Beijing escalates. Another live-fire event, a more aggressive posture at one of the other Spratly installations, a naval intercept of a U.S. surface asset. Or Beijing goes to the diplomatic track, seeking to negotiate the terms of an incident that neither side wants to formally acknowledge happened. The Lhasa's retreat north suggests the first option is currently under serious consideration in the relevant command chain. Flank speed north is not the movement of a force preparing a follow-on strike. It is the movement of a force that has received information suggesting the tactical situation is worse than anticipated and requires reassessment. But here is the open question that does not resolve cleanly, no matter how you look at the exchange data. The YJ-21 impacted 320 meters from USS Curtis Wilbur. The SPY-1D forward face is degraded. 3 VLS hatches are jammed. The destroyer that was conducting freedom of navigation operations northeast of Fiery Cross Reef is now operating with reduced capability in the area where it was challenged. Whether the Lhasa chose 320 meters as a calibrated demonstration or as the best available missed distance given the targeting constraints of the engagement, that question the Pentagon statement does not answer. The SITREP does not answer it. The commercial satellite imagery does not answer it. The answer to that question matters more than the runway at Fiery Cross. Because if 320 meters was chosen, if it was a controlled demonstration of the ability to bracket an Arleigh Burke at will, then what the Lhasa communicated was capability. And capability demonstrations at Mach 6, 19 minutes from a B-1B response, are a very specific kind of message that both sides are now going to spend a long time interpreting. The 48 hours following the exchange will also be shaped by an audience that neither Washington nor Beijing fully controls. The other navies operating in the South China Sea and adjacent waters. Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Force had 2 vessels in the Philippine Sea during the engagement window. The Royal Australian Navy had a frigate conducting passage north of the Lombok Strait. The Indian Navy's Eastern Fleet Command was tracking the situation from Port Blair. All of them received the same tactical data that 7th Fleet was processing in real time. All of them are now drawing their own conclusions about what the pre-delegation framework means for how the United States responds to kinetic actions against its naval forces, and by extension, what it might mean for kinetic actions against theirs if their alliance structures and access arrangements position them inside the same conditional strike architecture. The South China Sea is not a bilateral problem. It never was. But the engagement between the Lhasa and the Curtis Wilbur and the 19 minutes that followed it sent a signal that every regional navy will spend the next several weeks processing. The question is whether that signal reads as deterrence or provocation, and the answer differs depending on which flag is flying from your mast. What do you think? Was this a probe that Beijing expected to absorb without consequences? Or was it a miscalculation that exposed exactly how much the pre-delegation framework has changed the escalation math in the South China Sea? Drop your read in the comments. The answer matters for everything that comes next. The Fiery Cross runway is burning. The Lhasa is 40 nautical miles north and still moving. The B-1B is back on the ground at Diego Garcia, and the orbit track is still there, pre-authorized, preloaded, waiting. Subscribe to Global Warfare TV. We show you what South China Sea escalation actually looks like. System by system, decision by decision, 19 minutes at a time.